Mitchell comes off the screens, but so does Clark. Up and in! Timely. But not for Caitlin.
93% from the free throw line, and then the three-pointer, it's just smooth as silk. She lives for these moments, and she lived up.
The most important thing to understand about this entire sequence is that the final moment everyone remembers is actually the end result of a much deeper breakdown that had been building across multiple games for the Indiana Fever. The buzzer-beating shot from Caitlin Clark looks like a clean highlight on the surface, but it only happened because Indiana had already lost control of a game they should have closed much earlier. The shot wasn't drawn up for her, it wasn't part of the official late-game system, and it certainly wasn't the plan coming out of the timeout. Instead, it was a moment that emerged from chaos, improvisation, and complete breakdown of structure. What people saw as a heroic finish was actually the last possible solution to a situation that had already gone wrong in multiple ways before that final possession even began. Before this Washington matchup even started, Indiana was still mentally carrying the damage from their previous loss against New York. That game mattered because it exposed a pattern rather than just a single mistake. Indiana had been in control against New York with a double-digit lead late in the third quarter, and everything suggested they were on track for a comfortable win. Caitlin Clark was in rhythm, the offense was functioning, and the defensive effort was enough to maintain separation. But basketball games are often decided not just by talent, but by how a team responds when momentum starts shifting. In that New York game, Indiana failed to respond properly when things began to tighten, and that is where the problems started. As the New York game progressed, small disruptions began stacking up in a way that slowly changed the entire direction of the contest. Fouls came at moments that stopped Indiana from building rhythm, and each whistle acted like a reset that favored the trailing team. Instead of extending their lead, Indiana kept sending New York to the free throw line, allowing them to chip away at the margin without needing explosive scoring runs. At the same time, coaching rotations began to interrupt continuity. Players who were performing well were subbed out, lineups were changed too frequently, and instead of allowing chemistry to develop during critical minutes, Indiana kept breaking its own momentum. Over time, those small decisions turned into a full collapse of control. By the time Indiana realized what was happening against New York, the game had already shifted completely. What had been a controlled lead turned into a pressure situation where Indiana was reacting instead of dictating. New York gained confidence, the crowd energy shifted, and Indiana's offense stopped looking organized. Even after the game, Caitlin Clark acknowledged that the team had allowed the opponent back into the game during the third quarter, which is a simple statement but reflects a deeper issue about losing structure under pressure. That kind of loss doesn't just disappear after the final buzzer, it carries into the next game and how the team plays, thinks, and reacts. When Indiana arrived in Washington, they were supposed to reset and fix those issues quickly. On paper, this was a matchup they should control comfortably because Washington was a young, developing team without the same level of experience or consistency. Early in the game, it looked like Indiana had finally learned from their mistakes. The ball movement was sharp, the spacing was good, and the team was playing with confidence. Caitlin Clark was involved in both scoring and playmaking, Aaliyah Boston was dominating inside the paint, and Lexi Hull was contributing defensively in ways that helped stabilize the game. The structure looked clean, and Indiana built a strong lead that eventually reached double digits. By halftime, Indiana was ahead 43-29, and the game felt under control. Boston's presence inside was especially important because she was consistently finishing plays through contact and controlling rebounds, which prevented Washington from getting second-chance opportunities. Clark's ability to stretch the floor kept the defense honest, and Indiana's overall execution suggested that the previous collapse against New York was behind them. Even defensively, Indiana was active, closing passing lanes and forcing Washington into low-efficiency possessions. At that stage, everything pointed toward a comfortable win if they maintained discipline in the second half. However, the real problem in Indiana's season has not been their ability to start games, it has been their ability to sustain control when pressure increases. That issue became visible immediately in the third quarter. The offensive rhythm that defined the first half completely disappeared. Instead of quick decisions and fluid ball movement, Indiana began holding onto possessions too long and allowing the defense to reset. Players started relying more on isolation plays instead of continuing the team structure that had built the lead. Kelsey Mitchell, in particular, took more contested shots and slowed down possessions instead of moving the ball into better positions for Clark or Boston. As Indiana's offense stalled, Washington slowly began to gain confidence. This is one of the most important psychological shifts in basketball. When a leading team stops executing cleanly, the trailing team starts believing the game is winnable. Every empty possession from Indiana gave Washington more energy and urgency. The lead that once felt secure began to shrink not because Washington suddenly became dominant, but because Indiana stopped being efficient. Momentum in basketball is not just about scoring runs. It is about control of tempo, and Indiana lost that control completely in the third quarter. At the same time, Indiana's rotation issues returned and made the situation even more unstable. Caitlin Clark found herself in foul trouble, which forced her to sit during stretches where Indiana desperately needed offensive organization. Aaliyah Boston also dealt with foul issues, limiting her minutes and reducing Indiana's interior dominance. These interruptions meant that Indiana rarely had its best lineup on the floor when the game was tightening, and that lack of continuity made it harder to stabilize possessions. Without their key players consistently available together, Indiana's structure became fragmented. By the time the fourth quarter arrived, the game had fully changed direction. Washington had erased the double-digit deficit and turned the matchup into a tight, competitive battle. Indiana was no longer in control. They were reacting to everything. Possessions became more rushed, decision-making became less organized, and the offense increasingly relied on individual effort rather than system execution. The discipline that defined the first half was gone, and the game had turned into a possession-by-possession fight. With under a minute remaining, Washington actually took the lead. That moment reflected how far Indiana had fallen from their earlier control. A game they once led comfortably was now slipping away because of sustained offensive inconsistency, poor spacing decisions, and lack of structural stability. Indiana found itself in a situation where there was no clear system to rely on in the final moments, only improvisation and talent. That is not a position any team wants to be in during a close game. With just seconds left and Indiana trailing by 1 point, the final timeout was called. Whatever was drawn up in that huddle was not what ultimately decided the game. The intended play seemed designed to create a more controlled scoring opportunity, likely involving a closer shot near the basket or a structured perimeter action. However, Washington defended the initial action well, and the play quickly broke down as soon as the ball was inbound. There was no time to reset, no time to reorganize, and the structure that was supposed to guide the possession immediately collapsed. In that moment of breakdown, Sophie Cunningham made a decision that completely changed the outcome. Instead of forcing the original design, she scanned the floor and recognized something else. Caitlin Clark was available near half court with just enough space to receive the ball. Without hesitation, she threw a cross-court pass that went against the usual structure of late-game execution. That decision was not something drawn up in a playbook. It was instinct, awareness, and trust combined under extreme pressure. Most players would hesitate in that situation because breaking the play risks turnover, but Cunningham understood there was no time left for hesitation. Clark caught the ball cleanly at half court with roughly 1 second remaining. There was no dribble, no adjustment, and no attempt to advance closer to the basket. She immediately rose into a deep three-point attempt from about 31 feet out. The shot itself was extremely difficult, not because of defense alone but because of timing, distance, and pressure. It was the kind of attempt that usually only happens in desperation, but for Clark it was a natural read based on the clock and space. The ball left her hands instantly, traveled through the air, and went in as the buzzer sounded, giving Indiana a 78-76 victory. After the game, teammates described the moment as instinctive rather than scripted. Cunningham didn't execute a designed action, she reacted to what she saw in real time. Clark didn't follow a drawn-up system, she responded to opportunity with immediate confidence. That level of trust between players doesn't come from a single game. It develops over a full season of shared experiences, late-game situations, and understanding each other's tendencies under pressure. The connection between them turned a broken play into a winning moment. Even with the victory, the deeper issues within Indiana remain unresolved. The same problems that appeared against New York and again against Washington are still present: inconsistent offensive flow, unstable rotations, and difficulty maintaining control during momentum shifts. A single buzzer beater does not fix those structural weaknesses. What it does do is highlight both the strength and fragility of this team at the same time. Caitlin Clark remains the player most capable of changing outcomes in a single possession, but the fact that Indiana continues to rely on last-second improvisation to escape games they once controlled shows that there is still a significant gap between individual brilliance and team execution. At the same time, this entire sequence also exposes something deeper about how Indiana actually functions when games tighten up. Because when you strip away the highlight ending, what you're left with is a team that keeps drifting between control and collapse without a stable middle ground. The Indiana Fever don't look like a team that either dominates for 48 minutes or gets completely outplayed. They look like a team that builds strong leads, loses rhythm in the middle, and then relies on late-game chaos to survive. That pattern is becoming important because it shows up repeatedly, not just in one matchup but across multiple games where the structure breaks down under pressure. One of the biggest issues is how quickly their offensive identity disappears when pace slows down. In the first half of games, Indiana looks organized, with clear spacing and defined roles. Caitlin Clark creates advantage situations, Aaliyah Boston finishes inside, and the supporting cast moves with purpose. Another factor is how rotation changes continue to disrupt rhythm at the worst possible times. Instead of locking into consistent lineups during crucial stretches, Indiana often shuffles players in ways that break continuity. That becomes more damaging in close games because chemistry matters more when possessions are limited and every mistake is magnified. When Caitlin Clark is on the bench during key momentum swings, the offense loses its primary decision-maker. When Aaliyah Boston is in foul trouble, the interior threat disappears. These gaps force other players into roles they are not fully comfortable with, which reduces efficiency even further. Defensively, Indiana also struggles to maintain consistent pressure throughout games. There are stretches where they look active, switching well, contesting shots, and controlling rebounds, but those stretches are not sustained. When fatigue sets in or rotations shift, defensive breakdowns begin to appear, especially in transition and late clock situations. Opponents start finding easier looks not because Indiana's defense disappears completely, but because it becomes inconsistent at the exact moments when stops matter most. The psychological side of these games is just as important as the tactical one. Once Indiana loses a lead or sees it shrink quickly, their body language and decision-making change. Instead of continuing to trust their system, they start reacting to pressure. That is when turnovers increase, rushed shots appear, and possessions become less structured. It is not a lack of talent, it is a lack of stability under stress. And when that happens, even smaller teams begin to believe they are in control of the game. That is exactly what happened against Washington. The Mystics didn't need to dominate Indiana physically. They simply needed to stay close long enough for Indiana's structure to weaken. Once the Fever stopped executing cleanly in the third quarter, Washington's confidence grew possession by possession. Every missed shot, every stalled possession, and every defensive breakdown added to that momentum shift until the game was completely balanced again. By the time the final minutes arrived, Indiana was no longer playing with control. They were surviving possession by possession, trying to find any solution that could stop the bleeding. The fact that they had been up by double digits earlier in the game made the situation even more dramatic, because it wasn't about being outplayed from start to finish, it was about losing control after having it firmly in hand. That kind of loss of structure is often more frustrating than a straight defeat because it feels preventable. When the final possession unfolded, it reflected everything that had happened before it. The play wasn't clean, the spacing wasn't organized, and the initial design did not survive Washington's defense. Once the structure broke, the game shifted into instinct mode.